Welcome to Let's Thrive Postpartum.
Welcome back to Let's Thrive Postpartum. This is Kelly.
And I'm Ashley.
We are really excited to talk with you all today. One of the things that happens when you become a new mom, whether it's your first child or your fifth child, your identity shifts. And that identity shift can come with impacts to how you feel, who you are, how you see yourself. And so Ashley and I today really want to talk about what's happening with your identity, to think through stuff that you may not have put words to, which was very helpful for me when I was kind of going through this, figuring out, somebody pointing it out to me really helped me understand what was happening. And so with that, Ashley, let's kind of jump in and start talking about what identity changes happen in motherhood, how that impacts your mental health, and kind of thinking through what do we do going forward.
This is such a good topic. I know, and close to my heart too. I had some big identity shifts. And I think that motherhood, however you become a mother, is one of those times in our lives where it's this, like, in the blink of an eye, you are suddenly something new, right? Like when you're pregnant, you're pregnant. You're not quite yet a mom. You're not like the mom of a baby. And then all of a sudden, you're responsible for this little human. I'm trying to even think back about what other, like, what else could even compare when we're talking about identity shifts that happen for anyone. And
I can think of as when you get married, your name, if you change your name, that is an identity shift, but still that is not near as profound or impactful as suddenly you're a mom.
yeah, like suddenly you're a mom, like your role is changed, your responsibilities have changed, your ability to do things have changed, your expectation, like there's everything has changed in an instant. And I think some people do seem to have an easier time, I guess, more of like a soft landing into those new roles. And other people, and I was one of the other people, had a much harder landing into motherhood. And it was very jarring, this sense of like, I had lots of conversations going on in my head of, I can't do this anymore. I'll never be able to do this anymore. This is never going to be the same. Lots of those like nevers and shoulds and always, the things that, we say, don't say that. But there's so many things that change and happen in life that for a lot of people, it's hard for it not to affect you in some way, because you're trying to wrap your head around like, what does all of this mean? Who am I now that I'm, still my former self, but now I'm a mom? And what does that look like in life?
It's really true. And I think a lot of times we hear that there are expectations that are in our head that make this shift harder. Just like you said, I should be doing this. So maybe it is, I should not be going out with my friends for a glass of wine anymore because I'm a mother. Or I should be up cleaning the house or doing whatever expectation, whether it's subconscious or not, makes you feel one way or the other about who you now are.
Yeah. Yeah.
How do we think through, Ashley, what expectations we have? Because sometimes it's hard to realize that this is something that I expect mothers, and I'm doing air quotes right now, mothers to do because that's what we believe. How do we figure that out?
I think a lot of it comes just in some of it in reflecting like how you yourself were raised. I mean, I've come to realize that a lot of my expectations were based on how I was raised, and that my mom was a stay-at-home mom, had lots of, was very involved in lots of different things. I was working full time and trying to navigate like, well, what does that look like? And like daycare, drop off, or how do I, what do I do? I still had lots of friends that I wanted to go out and see, but it just felt strange to be like out in the places where I used to go before I was ever pregnant. And now to be out but I'm like, I'm a mom now. Like I have a baby. What? Like, what is this? And it was this strange, I think almost for me, it was like it didn't integrate for me very well. Everything was still this like dual. It was like the me beforehand, like at work, like people who knew me before I had a baby and friends who knew me before I had a baby. And then all of a sudden I had this new group of friends who only knew me after I had kids and had other babies like mine. And it was almost like it was this dividing line in my experience where I had this hard time like crossing it. And I don't know. It took a while as I had more friends with kids, that I started just feeling like, no, this is my life. This is all the things I get to do with my children. And I'm a mom.
And your mom, and you can still have friends and do things you want to do or that you previously did. That's slightly different.
Just slightly different. Just slightly different. So I think for people just thinking about like going back to expectations, kind of thinking through, I mean, I don't think I ever really thought explicitly like what are my expectations or my hopes for motherhood? Like what do I want the experience to feel like for me, to feel like for my kids? I think I was like, well, it's just going to happen and but I never thought through. I think the word is kind of having like an intention, because for me, like when I set sometimes an intention about something, it gives me like a goal, right? Like my intention this weekend was to like spend more time with my kids outside, something to think about and like frame my days around. Whereas having a baby, I didn't think about it at all. I was like, well, it's just going to happen and life will move on. But I didn't think about how or what it would feel like or what my goals were.
Well, let me ask a question, because this is a really good point. I think if all of us, everybody listening, thinking through what those expectations are, because actually you mentioned two things that are the same but slightly different. So your experience of what motherhood should be was, should it be a stay-at-home mom? Should it be these certain expectations? Is kind of slightly different than saying, this is my intention and what motherhood should feel like, about what motherhood should be. So maybe it is thinking, I expect motherhood to be blah, and writing down, I expect it to be making lunches, doing all these things that you have in your list in your head, is very different than saying, I expect it to be intentional.
Yeah. And I think if anybody out there's been in therapy, you probably have heard people talk about like core beliefs, these kind of innate beliefs about the world, which are all based on how we were raised. And so there's things that kind of come to mind automatically when you're like, motherhood. It looks different for everyone because everyone was raised differently. And so that is like, okay, I think my current framework is making these assumptions, some automatic assumptions. Do I agree with those or do I disagree with those? Like, are those going to work in my life or are they not going to work in my life? And then from there, you could say, okay, well, what I want is my intention for motherhood to be blah, 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 or for my childhood or for it to look like this. And it might be completely different than what those automatic assumptions are, because we're older now. We have more awareness and the ability to say, like, that was good for me when I was a kid. It's just not the way that I want to do it now. Or it's not, I have a completely different lifestyle and where things are going to be different. So it's just like the awareness of what is informing your assumptions about motherhood and anything in general. And then saying, I'm just thinking, this is literally me thinking out loud right now. but then saying, okay, well, what are my intentions? Are those really different? Are they pretty aligned? And if they're pretty different, it's going to take a lot of work because you're going to constantly be battling with yourself, right? Like with your experience and being like, nope, I don't want to do it that way. I want to do something different. And
I think you're right. Having it written down and looking at it lets you have a much better plan to process it. If you say, assumption of what I have of motherhood is very different than the intention I want to raise my child with, or the experience I want to have as a mother. It's saying, I expect this, but I don't want that. Makes it easier if you write it down. So if you're listening, sit down today, tomorrow, or in your head and just think, what assumptions do I have? Can you come up with 3? Can you come up with 10? And then what intentions do you want for motherhood? What does that identity look like to you? And how different are those two? And you get to make that choice over and over again. Like you said, Ashley, if you start struggling with that identity, how do you come back and say, does this match my intention?
Yeah. Yeah.
So let me ask kind of a follow-up question to that. If you are going through your intentions or your assumptions, and maybe it's vastly different than who you previously were. Maybe you now have this intention of what you want motherhood to be versus who unmotherhood you were. That's not the right word, but you know what I'm saying. A lot of times that can be very jarring if you're kind of grieving something that you used to have or you were and you're not going to be or aren't are anymore.
Yeah.
Can we talk about what does grieving your identity loss mean? How does that impact you negatively?
I mean, I think that, and a lot of people will say when they hear the word grief, they're like, that is a good word to describe like how I've been feeling. Because with any big shift with motherhood, like there are parts of you that are never going to be the same, right? Like you're never going to go back. And I mean, you could technically say this every day that you wake up, but with this big change when you have a baby, like you're never going to be the same person you were before, right? Like there's just that, again, it's that whole new set of responsibilities and love and all these different things that are wrapped up in this tiny little baby. And when you're thinking about who you were before, a lot of people talk about like the sense of freedom, like you didn't realize what this idea or the ability to just decide what you want to do. You're not beholden to other people's schedules. That is one of those big parts of grieving, right? I know, Kelly, we've talked about like being able to go to the bathroom on your own, or just especially with little babies when it's like sleeping and feeding and diaper changes and it's constant. And you're like, I now, like, this is what everything is revolving around. Whereas before, you would wake up, you did whatever you wanted on the weekends, maybe you would go to work, you could do whatever you wanted to after work. You could stay up really late because you were the only person that had to wake up the next morning. Like there were a lot more freedoms and like choices that you were completely autonomous. Like you had full autonomy over what you were doing. When you introduce a baby, you lose for a while a lot of autonomy.
And how we talked, or Ashley, about how the identity shift, kind of who are you now hit you. I was one of the people where the identity loss kind of hit me, and it was exactly that. And I don't think we're out of the norm. So I found a recent study that happened in the UK that said nearly 2/3 of new moms felt they had lost their identity since they became a parent. And so the shift, you're right, it's just gone. And there are so many things, your freedom, your privacy, the ability to be quiet, your career that kind of shifts, whether it's permanent or short term, intimacy, predictability, alone time, ability to go socialize when you wanted to. I mean, there's so many things that change. And I think having someone point out to me that grief is a reaction to change. If you've lost some of this, it's healthy to go through some processes of grief.
Yeah. Yeah. Because that's what it is. Like you've lost something and that you're not ever going to get back in the same way. And so that is like sometimes you do feel this profound sense of like sadness, right? Or when you're thinking like things are never going to be the same, right? It's sadness and it's grief. And I think it's something, yeah, like you don't talk about a ton, but there's just, because it's all internal, right? This is all going on like in our heads and in our bodies. And yeah, I don't know. We don't talk about it enough.
We don't. And I feel like there's a lot of shame that goes along with it as a mom, because two things I keep learning, two things can be very true. You can be grieving some of the aspects of your old life and also be extremely happy or thankful or one does not negate the other. So you can be so happy to be a mom or so excited about your child and love it to death. And also grieving the fact that you can't go to the bathroom by yourself anymore. That privacy is now gone with the board. And that's okay. And so I think as a mom hearing it's acceptable to grieve some of your areas of loss, really healthy. And I think as you're sitting here and you're writing down your assumptions and your intentions, take a few minutes to think through Are there any areas of your life that you are grieving at this moment or that you feel like lost at the moment so that it does make it easier to kind of process those and say, this will change. It's not going to last forever.
And something too, I want to point out that I hear all the time and that I see all the time in comment sections on the internet, going back to this idea that two things can be true. Just because you are missing parts of life from before you had a child in no way means that like you wish it was different. It in no way means that you're not grateful. It in no way means that you like are unhappy with a choice that you made, because people love to point out you should be grateful. This is a choice you made. You did, like, you decided to do this. And it's like, yes. And it can still be hard, right? Like, and we love to have, I think, as humans in general, this more like this or that thinking, right? Like if you're sad about losing your identity, it means that you regret being a mom, right? No, absolutely not. Absolutely not. So for any mom out there, like if it comes in your head and you're immediately feeling this sense of like shame or guilt, I feel so guilty that I want time away from my kids. I feel so guilty that I want to go see my friends. No, it's normal. You're human. Two things can be true. You can love your kids with every single ounce of your being. And that's okay. I think that was one of the most helpful things for me to just constantly tell myself is like, wait a minute, it makes no sense that it has to be one or the other. That like me being sad means that like some big decision or some like other big feeling, it doesn't negate the other. It doesn't mean that, that anyone has really the right to say, like, you chose this, you should be grateful. No, no. So if anybody says that to you, just look and be like, it's so sad that you feel that way. And walk away.
You're allowed to have two emotions and it's completely acceptable. And you're right, it's very, very normal. It's just not something we talk about often as new moms or even moms of toddlers or moms of teenagers. It's just not something that is shared often. And so we like to bring up things that we don't talk about often so that there is less shame and guilt to it. So it's real interesting because looking back, this transition to being a mom, very different than who I was before, but I'm also very different now than I was 10 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Ahead, I know I'm going to be very different in my identity 10 years from now as I am right now. So I think something also very refreshing when you're going through this identity shift to be like, this isn't going to last forever. You're going to get your in who you are, and you're also going to be a very different person in the future because that's what happens in life, right? Like we're constantly changing and moving one way or the other.
Yep. Always. I mean, priorities shift over time, our interests change over time. There's so many things that are constantly changing. It's just that motherhood happens suddenly. And, you know, the process of maturing, right, and becoming an adult and in middle age and older age, that seems to happen more slowly. So it just isn't, I like the word you used, as jarring. Like it's not as jarring. But when you think back to your, 20-year-old self, sometimes it's comical about how different of a person you were, you know?
It is. It's a looking back. I think my hope for all of us is that we look back to this transition, your identity changes after becoming a mother with kind of those rose-colored glasses and a little bit of grace to say, you know what? She went through a lot right then, but look who she is now, right? Like I made it and here's who I am. And it's okay to look back and say, that was rough. I was figuring out who I was.
Yeah. No, it's okay. There's so much that happens in that change, and it's all, I mean, it's all us. It's not anyone's fault. It's just part of what happens. And I think for some people it just hits a little harder than it does for others.
It does. So, and I think awareness of where you are can help you go through this process a little easier or at least more aware of what's happening. So as we were talking back through this, If you can, sit down and make a list of what your assumptions I think motherhood is or motherhood should be. And then sit down and write out your list of these are my intentions and core beliefs of what I want motherhood to be or I expect it to be. How different are those? How much of a shift are you going to have? And then I really recommend sitting down and writing anything that you're grieving that you might be. And it could be as simple as the ability to go to the bathroom. It could be the ability to take a shower without having to ask someone's permission so that you can walk away from a child, right? What are those things that you are grieving? Because that will help you kind of process this change with a little bit more ease and awareness. So when you do look back, because you are going to be different in the future, you can say, I tried to make that a little bit easier for myself. Man, that was hard.
Yeah. And that list too, like of the things that you're really aware of that you're grieving can kind of be a good jumping off point for what you could use some extra support with. Because
Yes.
like if you're really grieving that every day you can't take a shower without worrying the baby's going to wake up, right? Are there some days somebody could come over and like sit with the baby? Or like, can you change the time that you're taking a shower so that your partner has the baby? Because that is hard too. I mean, I remember every day I'd get in the shower and be like, oh God, is this going to be a 30-second shower? Or do I get a 10-minute shower? Like, what is
For those days, yes, it's true.
and so again, like if you're missing like time with friends or going out to restaurants or something like that, then maybe that's a sign. Okay, can we get a babysitter and go out to dinner? When was the last time I had dinner with a friend? Oh, it's been months. Okay, well, let's put that on the to-do list. So it'll probably give you some clues about, yes, you're grieving it, but some of those things you may also be able to like call in some extra support so that you can reintroduce them back into your life, because that's the other part with like your identity is your former self is not gone, right? You're still going to have the same interests and like to do the same things. Yes, especially in the newborn phase, there's certain things that are just very difficult to do, right? Camping, hiking, whatever. That you can still do it. Hey, I've seen it. Would love to hear some stories about moms taking their little babies camping. But it doesn't mean that it's gone forever. So trying to be aware of like, what are these things that I love? When can I bring them back in and like share that love with my child? And I think that's like one of my favorite things is I love being outside. And so now it's like, well, I get to try and impart my love for being outside with my kids and hope that they come to like it too. Some days they do, some days they don't. But that's where you get to share these pieces of yourself with your kids. But again, sometimes you get in these routines of the schedules and other things that it feels really hard. But again, sitting down and just taking a minute to think about it gives you a chance to say, well, how do I bring some of that back into my life? Like just my life as a mom.
Yes. And I think as we kind of wrap this up, I think that's it. Let's add a fourth thing to your list. And those are those identity wins that are new. Ashley, like you just said, you can now share your love with nature with your children. That's an identity win. Maybe it's that you've realized you've gained a lot more patience than you ever thought you had. Or maybe it's you've realized you've come through something really hard and you are stronger than you ever thought you were as a person. What are those wins that you can look back and say, this is a win for me? In addition to thinking about that grieving part, what are all the new things? Maybe it's that profound love for your child. Maybe it's just a new feeling of selflessness, right? It could be so many little different things that you now say, this is a positive that I can put in my win bucket for my identity shift. Sharing nature, those things that you now have that you didn't have before.
Yeah. The things that are important to you are always going to be important to you, right? Whatever that is in terms of hobbies and like dreams and things you like to do. And it just takes a while sometimes for them to come back
Yes.
after you get through the newborn phase.
So moms, we see you. I think we've both kind of been there on feeling different ways of shifts to your identity. Hopefully sitting down and doing your intentions, your assumptions, your griefs, your wins can help you kind of process any of the shifts that's happening. And don't think it stops after the first few weeks. These shifts kind of continue to happen throughout motherhood. So it's just a good tool for your tool belt to say, you know what, I need to process and identify and be aware of some of these things that are happening because you're doing a great job, mom. And we see you. And we really hope this has been helpful this week.
Yeah.
With that, we'll see you on next episode.
If you enjoyed this episode and found it helpful, please be sure to hit subscribe, leave us your feedback, and give us a 5-star review. For even more support, visit us at wethrivepostpartum.com/podcast to sign up for our newsletter and learn more about our community. Remember, you are not alone. With support, you can feel better. Together, let's thrive postpartum.